Okay. Welcome to this third episode of CenterView, a first of its kind virtual discussion series sponsored by Baltimore's oldest and preeminent business networking and dining club, the Center Club. It's our aim to feature the people, the issues impacting our present and shaping our future. And we're delighted to be able to feature prominent and accomplished Baltimoreans and others from across our region who are making a difference. I'm your host, Greg Tucker. I'm privileged to be your host. I'm a board member here at the Center Club and a longtime member, and I'm an independent strategic communications advisor. But enough about me. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome Wes Moore, not only someone I'm privileged to count as a close friend, but a leading voice in our nation for public policies and philanthropic efforts to counteract the systemic inequities, economic disparities that plague so many of our communities across the nation. As we know, they trap individuals, they trap whole families in poverty and deprive them of access to essential resources such as education, quality housing, food sources, adequate public transportation, employment, training, job opportunities. We're fortunate to count Wes a Baltimorean, a graduate from Valley Forge Military College, a graduate of Johns Hopkins University, Phi Beta Kappa, a Rhodes Scholar in International Relations at Oxford University. Wes became captain in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division and was deployed to Afghanistan. He then secured a White House fellowship serving under then Secretary. He then was in investment banking in New York and then returned to Baltimore to found Bridge EDU, which is all about supporting students entering their freshman year of college and enhancing their prospects for long-term success. And then in 2017, he became the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, one of the largest anti-poverty nonprofits in the United States. And we're going to spend some time discussing his work with Robin Hood. Welcome, Wes. It's terrific to have you. Thanks for making time for us. You're a busy guy. I know you're here in Baltimore, you're in New York, but thanks so much. It means everything.
Let me tell you something. I have officially made it. I'm getting a chance to sit down with Tucker. This is good. Honestly, it's a real pleasure. And as I'm looking across this grid of all these faces and names, I mean, there's so many friends and people I respect and admire. People who are just deeply committed to our hometown. So it's absolutely my pleasure. For those of the Jewish faith, I wish you a sweet New Year. But it really is a joy to be here with you today. So thank you.
Thank you, Wes. Well, Wes, we're going to spend some of our discussion on your new book, 5 Days: The Fiery Reckoning of an American City, which chronicles, of course, the tragic death of Freddie Gray and the uprising that followed his death in police custody, as experienced by 8 other Baltimoreans. So, first of all, congratulations on this important contribution as the nation continues to grapple with the effects of our nation's original sin and the legacy of systemic racism and the death of so many Black citizens at the hands of law enforcement. So I know that this is something that you've been working on for quite some time. We've talked about it privately, and share with us a bit how you came to write this.
It's I remember when the idea of first putting this down on paper started to really formulate, and a lot of it was just my own personal search and journey, right? Because I think one thing that we saw in all of us as Baltimoreans, I think we realized that if there's one thing Baltimore is full of, it's opinions. And you're hearing these various opinions from all over about people who are thinking and understanding and dissecting what happened, where was the breakdown, what was the takeaways. And I think part of the beauty of, I think both, my role and job, but also just, is an ability to understand and have good relations with folks from kind of all over the spectrum. And that's really what I wanted to share with 5 Days, is that this is complex and it's hard. And to be able to walk a narrative of 5 days through the eyes of people as diverse as, Tawanda Jones, a woman who lost her brother to police violence just a few years before Freddie Gray, and who's literally marching with the Gray family and saying to herself, I love that Baltimore is standing up to the fact that this is going on and people are paying attention. But at the same time, she's also thinking to herself, but where was this when my brother was killed? And you're also walking in the same pages, you're walking with Mark Partee, who is a West Baltimore product, who's a police major, one of the highest ranking African-American members of the Baltimore Police Department, who literally, I remember where I was when he said to me, he said, you know, none of my colleagues woke up that morning with homicide in their mind. But I also know why for kids in West Baltimore, why they don't believe me. And so when you get a chance to understand this from a variety of different perspectives, it was something that I first thought, it was my understanding of that's the way life is, right? Everyone's going to have their different ideas and different interpretations depending on where they're coming from. At the same time, it was really important for me to be able to dissect that this wasn't just about what happened in that initial interaction or that final interaction between Freddie Gray and law enforcement. While that was an important component to this story, I was also very deliberate about the fact of not making this the story or the final moments of Freddie Gray, or even just like the Freddie Gray story, right? This was about an entire context that we have to be able to understand as a society, and that's how I wanted to make sure that I framed all these different narratives.
Well, that's exactly where I'd like to sort of kick off here, because in many ways, I thought the essence of your book is summed up by this passage. I'm going to take a second to read here, if you allow me, because I thought it so summarized what the issues are that you're trying to address. So Freddie Gray and so many other boys like him grew up in the type of poverty that permeates everything. How you are educated, the water you drink, the home you live in, the air you breathe, the school you spend most of your days in, the way you are policed, whether or not you will die in the same poverty you were born in. It was that poverty that raised the probability that Freddie would be exactly where he was on April 12th, 2015, and then again on April 27th, 2015. In fact, the odds started being stacked against Freddie generations before he was born.
It's one of these things where, as I started to pull this together, in fact, it was one of the reasons why I first reached out to Erica Green, who I collaborated with, who was with The Sun, is now with the New York Times, and started thinking to myself that we spent so much time as a larger collective focusing on the horror and the tragedy of Freddie's death, and we needed to. Right? This was a young man who made eye contact with police and ran. And by the way, that only triggers probable cause in certain neighborhoods. Had a person done that in Guilford or in Roland Park, that doesn't trigger probable cause. It triggered probable cause because it happened in Harlem Park. It triggered probable cause because it happened in Sandtown, Winchester. And the other thing to remember with that is that so much of the focus was on what happened when you had this young man who made eye contact with police, and an hour later, he's in a coma by the time he makes it to University of Maryland, has 3 broken vertebrae and a crushed larynx. But the other thing I wanted people not to forget was the tragedy of his life. That this was a young man who was born underweight and premature. This was a young man who was born, his mother never made it to high school. She could not read or write. She lived in deep poverty her entire life. She gave birth to her twins in deep poverty. She also battled addiction for much of her life. And so when Freddie Gray was born, both him and his twin sister were exposed to heroin. By the time they had gained enough weight that they were able to leave the hospital and move into the house they grew up in over on North Carey Street over in West Baltimore, that house, along with 480 other homes, were cited in a civil lawsuit because the endemic levels of lead inside of their home, where the CDC indicates that if someone has more than up to or more than 6 microbes of lead in every deciliter of blood, that person's going to have cognitive damage for the remainder of their life. Freddie Gray had 36. And so this was a young man who was born premature, underweight, born into deep poverty, exposed to heroin, and lead poisoned. And by the way, by this time in his life, he's 2 years old. And so I remember a good buddy of mine who's actually a minister here in Baltimore. He actually said something to me that I thought that really stuck with me and actually resonated when I started thinking about how do we tell these stories? How do I understand my own complicity, all of our own complicity? The fact that I attended Freddie Gray's funeral, and that was the first funeral I've ever attended of anybody who I never knew them while they were still living. And the fundamental problem with that was that arguably the most peaceful week of Freddie's life was the week he was in a coma. because at least that week he was surrounded by doctors and nurses. And at least that week he was surrounded by activists and lawyers. At least that week the entire city knew his name. At least that week the entire city cared whether he lived or died. And that, to your point, Greg, that's the power and the pain of poverty, is that you're no one's constituent. You're no one's advocacy point. You are essentially living in an existence that's unseen. And so when we understand the dynamics that took place that led up to this, we have to be able to delve into the fact that we need very real policing reform and all these other measures that we can talk about later on. And let's also be clear. Freddie Gray never had a shot. He never had a chance. And there's something so fundamentally wrong with that as well, as we're talking about how do we address these things in these moments, because the dynamics that were at play in not just his death, but the dynamics that were at play in his life are very real. The policing system was not the only system that failed Freddie Gray. It was just the last.
Well, on that point, later in your book, you reflected that as you sat in the back of New Shiloh Baptist Church, awaiting the start of the funeral, and for Freddie Gray, and you observed so many civic leaders coming together and gathering, and you wondered, was this just theater, as you put it, and or was this going to be a moment, a real catalyst for change, for measurable change? Without putting you on the spot or turning this into a political discussion, I think that's not where we want to go. I'd ask you, what's your assessment these 5 years later?
I think if we look at what fundamental changes exist right now, and we look at where things were 5 years ago, it's difficult for anyone to argue that we have made systemic or structural changes in that process. Now, to be this is not saying that things aren't happening. There are a lot of people who are doing really good work on the ground right now. But we cannot rely on individual good deeds to change structural problems that exist. The problems are far bigger than that. We need to be able to dissect what it means to be able to put a core focus on making sure that children are born on this earth healthy. We have to put a greater focus on making sure that kids can actually enter into school prepared to learn, knowing letters and numbers and colors. We have to be able to make sure that we have a school system that's better able to support them. Right now, we still have a school system where the kids can't drink the water, right? And so there is still so much that we have to be able to unpackage and dig out, not to mention the fact that we still have to be able to address the other pieces and the other pieces that directly are correlated to what happened to Freddie, and that is, how are we thinking about the reformation of policing inside of communities that are making sure that every single community feels like the police, as I was saying in the story, that the sound of a police siren has a different pitch depending on what neighborhood you live in. And how do we make sure that that doesn't necessarily have to be the case for kids who are growing up in Baltimore, regardless of where in the Black Butterfly that you happen to call home?
Right. I've noticed many people are still joining and a few late. So if you're joining, we're delighted to have with us Wes Moore and our discussion with him and his latest book, 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City. Many have said, Wes, that the death of George Floyd somehow felt different, that we're at a true inflection point when a majority of Americans are willing once and for all, as it were, to confront the reality of racism and inequities and demand accountability for the type of policing that targets Black and brown citizens disproportionately. So it's exactly the point you made. Do you feel that that's the case, or how much will it take? How much more will it take before we get there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one, honestly, Greg, that I wrestle with, right? Because I come of two minds on this. One, I do come of the mind that the beauty of what's happened to George Floyd is, I think that there's two things that we see as dynamic. One, I think about it in terms of the release date for 5 days. The reality is 5 days was supposed to be released on April 15th. And right around the anniversary of everything happened, the 5-year anniversary. And I remember I closed my offices at Robinhood in the the end of February. So I closed them pretty early. And I remember very soon after that calling my publisher and saying, I cannot release this book on this date. I can't get my head, I mean, right now I am so singularly focused on leading this organization through this moment. I'm so singularly focused on the fact that we were already watching the early indicators of what COVID was going to do, both in terms of health and also the economic implications. And so I said, I can't get my head wrapped around it right now. I got to focus. And their response was, we get it. How about, and they literally picked a random date. They're like, how about June 23rd? And I was like, awesome, great. June 23rd sounds great. Because I was like, anytime, as long as it's not April, I'm good. And then a few weeks later, we learned the names Ahmaud Arbery. We learned the names Breonna Taylor. We learned the name George Floyd. And so it's interesting, people say how they're like, the timing of this book was impeccable. And I think that my ultimate response to that was, one is, there's a horror to how timely this thing was. And the second piece is, name a time when it wouldn't have been timely. And that's the point, right? I do think, though, we find ourselves in a unique moment, though. And I think it's for two reasons. One is, I think people are understanding that this is not just exclusively about policing. 2020 has kind of thrown these two genuine crises at our doorstep. And the first was this introduction of a virus that has had absolutely catastrophic health and economic implications, and the other was a very unneeded reminder how inequitable policing is in different communities. But the reality is that both of these crises, despite the fact that they're different, they actually expose the very same truth. While COVID-19 impacted everybody, it didn't impact everybody equally. You know, people of color contracted COVID at twice the rate, have also died at twice the rate, and that statistic has stayed constant. Police reform is necessary for all communities, but the reality is we did watch George Floyd on camera take his last breaths while handcuffed on the ground. And we watched his name being added to this longer lineage of others, right? Michael Brown, Philando Castile, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Sean Bell, Anthony Anderson, Chris Brown, Tyrone West, Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, Laquan McDonald, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, right, and how this list goes on. But we know that dealing with COVID is not about the discovery of a vaccine. Dealing with inequitable policing is not about the elimination of chokeholds. That the protests that we're seeing, which, by the way, they're estimating 1 in 10 Americans have attended at least one protest. This is now the largest and longest sustained protest in our nation's history. That they're not just protesting about police reform. The protests are about racism. And it's about systemic racism and how it shows itself in so many different ways. And the thing that actually gives me a real sense of hope in this moment, and why I think this moment could actually be very different, is because something goes from a moment into a movement when it's not just the impacted population who are screaming for justice. And we've seen that in history, right? We saw it here in Baltimore, where if you look at the protests that were taking place during Freddie Gray, frankly, it was a very color-coded, monolithic protest that was taking place in Baltimore 5 years ago. This time around, if people were watching the protests that were taking place in Baltimore, it was a mosaic of the city that was protesting. We saw the same thing when it came to the civil rights movement. One of the things that made the civil rights movement so effective was it eventually just was not just African Americans who were screaming about the fact that what we have in this country and the fact that we have separate, second-class citizens and separate but equal is inhumane and un-American. You know, what we saw when it came to the ending of apartheid is that it wasn't just Black South Africans who were saying, how does a system of apartheid exist in the whole world over to include corporate partners, said, we'll pull if you all don't fix this system. What happened when it came to our LGBTQI, brothers and sisters and friends? It was eventually when the world over acknowledged the fact that love is love, right? It was when we had people who were not part of an impacted community who are now screaming for the rights of an impacted community. And I think we are hitting a point right now where both there is a coalition and there's a recognition of the fact that this is not just about policing, and it's not just about what happened in these individual cases. It is a larger issue of how do we deal with and unwrap and unpackage this idea and this issue of systemic racism that exists. And the second piece is, how do we then have a concerted, coordinated conversation around it, and not something where we're just listening to the appeals of others with a sense of sympathy and just hoping that it goes away quickly.
Let me turn a second to your work with Robin Hood. As CEO, you oversee one of the largest, most impactful organizations confronting poverty and the issues we're talking about that perpetuate the cycle of hopelessness and violence and the plague areas like Baltimore and other major cities, New York, parts of New York. Share with us, if you will, your efforts to broaden the focus of Robin Hood. I know that's been a big, I remember when you started in 2017, it's hard to believe it's already, wow, coming up on 4 years, but that was one of your priorities, and to expand its impact beyond the New York City proper area. And last year, I know it was 129 million or somewhere thereabouts, right? In some of the, you deployed in some of the best poverty fighting organizations.
Yeah, it was, and listen, I remember sitting in our living room talking about this before I even jumped on, and it was funny because when Robin had first approached me about this, my first gut reaction was actually no, right? And it was for a few different reasons. The first reason was I was like, I'm a Baltimorean and I'm a Marylander and I'm not moving. We never moved. We stayed here in Baltimore and I just commuted back and forth. The second piece was I said, I'm enjoying the work that I'm doing, and I like the fact that we had a focus on this area, and if it was going to be a kind of a New York exclusive based thing, it just becomes complicated for me. And the third piece was the fact that I said, I've been critical of philanthropy, and I remember for when I first said to them, they said, yeah, it's all over YouTube and we've seen it. So I was like, so you've done your diligence. And so when I came back and we then had further conversations about it, the idea became that we could actually penetrate and have a bigger impact outside of the 5 boroughs, even though that Robin Hood was born and bred and built, within New York. The fact is, the issue of poverty is not a New York issue, and so one of the first initiatives that we built as I became the CEO was this thing called Mobility Labs. And what Mobility Labs is, it's a $25 million initiative that is really focusing on how do we understand this issue of economic mobility through urban, rural, and suburban environments. Because even though they have some differentiated backstones, the reality is there's certain things that are threads that you just see within poverty as a whole. And so we picked various communities to include Baltimore City, where we are investing in, also including Northeast Pennsylvania, kind of like the Scranton, Wilkes-Barre area, suburban Illinois, suburban Chicago, kind of, Cook County, Illinois, the Bay Area. And so we're actually investing in all these different places and looking at what are those threads that create these measures and these levers of sustainable economic mobility. Because one thing I am an organization we're not at all in the mood for is this idea of poverty alleviation, because I'm not sure what that even means. Poverty alleviation to me means how are you making poverty more tolerable, which I'm not at all interested in. The second piece that we really started drilling in on is how do we understand and recognize the role that policy plays in all this? Because the reason that we have such sustainable and such drastic measures of economic inequality is not because philanthropy hasn't done its job, right? There are policies that are both putting people and keeping people in poverty. There are policies that are creating a cap on the level of economic mobility, and part of the reason that we have these levels of generational poverty and why poverty is so predictable. And so how then do we think about creating economic opportunity for all people, ways of actually being able to create pathways, a way to be able to create opportunities for the larger, the working people, the large middle class, and how do we then have a fundamental, bigger jurisdictional conversation about that? And so by building policy wings, by focusing on these issues like mobility labs, by being able to, even the way we think about our grant making, by truly bringing in the impacted population into all of our grant making. So for example, when we think about our grants, whether it's from the relief fund or some of these other areas that we're focusing on, the people who are part of the communities that we are working with and serving, they don't just have a voice, now they have a vote. And that's an important component if you actually want to be able to get to the solutions that you're trying to drive towards, because the people who oftentimes are closest to the challenge are oftentimes also going to be the ones who are closest to the solutions you're looking for. And so these are just a new lens in the way I think we've tried to target and bring forward that level of growth within the organization.
I want to stay on philanthropy just a second here. I know in your book you point out that the cost of child poverty alone has been assessed at something like $1 trillion
Yep.
annually.
1.1 trillion.
And so there is a limit to what, as you point out, as you just said, what philanthropy can accomplish. As an example, what 700 billion is funneled annually in this country to various philanthropic causes. After you strip away what goes to universities, religious institutions, hospitals, you got about 175 that then gets divided among environmental causes, animal causes, support for seniors, veterans, education. So we're a generous nation, but indeed it's not enough. It's just not enough.
And I mean, I think about it in the context of even this work, right? Where, we'll allocate 150, 200 plus $1 million every year, right? And so there's a significant amount of capital that we will allocate and put out into the field, using data, using analytics, in a very real and significant way, right? And funding everything from where I say where the collapse of economic opportunity is either the cause or the consequence. We will find and fund and build and create if necessary. The budget for the Department of Education in New York City alone is $27 billion. In New York City alone. So the idea that these holes can be filled with the $1 million increments, I think there's a certain amount of humility that we have to bring to the work. And it's one of the reasons that we work so closely with, mayors and governors and senators, et cetera. It's because our philanthropy can be catalytic. Our philanthropy can be risk capital. I always say the investments that I'm most proud of are the investments that I don't have to make for very long, because we put an exit strategy on that initial investment. And that exit strategy is either the problem needs to be solved, or we're now investing in something that we're now able to present to mayors and governors and say, this thing works and we've de-risked it. And now it's ready for you to be able to scale it out and broaden out, because oftentimes government is not going to be first money in on innovations, nor should they. That's our job. Let us do that. However, there needs to be a pathway to be able to know that the things that we are investing in and the things that we are de-risking, the service we are providing and the work that we are doing, that there then has to be that natural arc about how this is not just pacifying a problem over a sustained period of time, but actually solving it. That this is not about making organizations bigger, it's about how we're making problems smaller.
I want to ask you, touch, if you will, on the impact of COVID. There's, of course, it caught us all by surprise. We're still living with it, and no clear end in sight. But in terms of the focus you have on poverty at Robin Hood, how this is, when you think about how it's decimated the financial condition of so many across the country, it's taken mothers and fathers, those who provide, and putting so many others on the brink of poverty. How have you had to pivot? What did you have to do differently when you budgeted and when you plan the year ahead? And then,
yeah, it is impossible to overstate the impacts of COVID-19, and both impossible to talk about it from the health perspective, and the fact that now in this nation we are now north of 200,000 people that have lost their lives to this illness. The other thing, though, it's impossible to talk about the fact that we had periods where we lost 11 years of job growth in 11 weeks. We literally watched progress and momentum that has shown itself, and that, by the way, was hard fought. When you think about what happened after the collapse of 2008, this past decade was a hard fought decade, where it's literally inching and scratching to get back as much as possible. Also, it's understanding the difference between, people say, well, we this massive bull market. True. There is a difference between the markets and the economy, right? And there was scratching and pulling to be able to gain what was lost. And the reality is that what we have continued to see is not just the level of exacerbation that we've seen in these measures and levels of inequality, but also, frankly, it was also an exposure. It was an exposure of the fact that even though we had certain levels of progress and momentum, it was still very pocketed and it was still very disparate. So, for example, at Robinhood, we have a partnership with Columbia University where we work on something together called the Poverty Tracker. And really, what the Poverty Tracker is, it's a longitudinal data set of 4,000 individuals and families in the city, and it's really where you're able to get real time analysis on where they are to be able to understand trends. Here are some of the things that the Poverty Tracker showed us. Is that during this, during the peak of the pandemic, the 5 hotspots for COVID-19 in New York City alone had an average per capita income of $25,000. What it also showed us was that 50% of New Yorkers have lived in poverty for at least a year over the past 4 years. Not 50% of a borough, not 50% of a demographic. 50% of the city lived in poverty for at least a year over the past 4 years. And so you're seeing how there were significant gaps that were existing even beforehand. Nationally, 23% of people that lost their jobs due to COVID-19 were people who were living in poverty before COVID-19, i.e., these were the working poor. The ones who were working jobs, in some cases, multiple jobs, and were still living below the poverty line. And so part of the challenge that I think we really have to wrestle with when it comes to ways we're going to recover, when it comes to COVID-19, is the distinct reality that when people say, so what does the bottom look like? The honest answer is, I don't know yet. The thing that I do know is that we're not there yet. That's the one thing I do know, right? And so how do we talk about a measure of economic recovery when we know that there are still challenges that are going to be laying ahead? And so how we think about our role in terms of our philanthropy, what we've learned. I mean, this is actually the third time in Robinhood history that we've launched a relief fund. The only other two times in history that Robinhood launched a relief fund was after 9/11. The other time was after Hurricane Sandy, and now this, and we've had really two distinct focus areas for our philanthropy during this time period. One has been on being able to support the social service sector, because the social service sector is just taking an absolute beating right now. Many of these organizations, they just don't have the balance sheets to survive. And the second issue is on this issue of emergency cash assistance. Because even we know when people say, well, there were certain organizations or certain people, wasn't there a emergency cash assistance component to things like the CARES Act? There was, but it excluded millions of people. For example, if you were undocumented, there was no cash assistance that was coming your way, even if you were working and were a taxpayer. If you were part of a mixed status family, there was no cash assistance that was coming your way. If you were working but weren't making enough to hit the tax filing threshold, there was no cash assistance coming your way. People were incarcerated and coming home. There was no cash assistance coming your way. And so we've really centered in and focused our philanthropy on those two areas. And also a big piece is on the advocacy piece, on advocating for things like how are we dealing with the fact that we're going to have a tsunami of evictions that are well on their way. And again, that's not a New York phenomenon. The numbers that we are about to see in Baltimore, the numbers that we'll see in the state of Maryland are staggering. And so it's how exactly do we use our voice also in order to advocate for things that we know are going to be crucially important for a population that we work with and serve.
Big stuff. We have a very eager audience, and they promise that they'll have a shot at asking questions. So we're going to move to that portion now. The game here. So if you can click your, you'll have to unmute yourself, of course. If you're going to ask a question, you can also, we can see you if you'd like, and you can raise your hand with that great little device there, that little tool, so that we can see you and call on you. So we're open. Welcome the first question. Anybody would like to kick it off? Go right ahead. I'm looking here for. Don't all raise your hand at once. Go ahead.
Now we can keep talking too. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know there are questions though. It is probably just getting used to the technical aspect here. Anybody? Yeah,
I have a question.
go ahead. Who is this?
This is Charles Young.
How are
Hey,
you,
Charles.
Charles?
I'm doing fine. My question is, I'm sorry, I did get on late, and I caught the tail end of what you was talking about, how the project you're working on, the CEO was in New York. Are you thinking about doing something similar in Baltimore, or do you have something like that in Baltimore already?
Yeah, no. So thank you very much, Charles. I was saying earlier that one of the conditions when I came down when I took over the role at Robinhood was that that we're not moving. Our family has maintained and still are Baltimoreans, even though Robinhood is headquartered in New York. And we've actually been making significant investments. We have something called Mobility Labs, where we launched a $25 million fund, and Baltimore is actually one of the core partners now. We're actually partnering with the Weinberg Foundation, with the Gates Foundation, with Tipping Point. And so working with a collection of other philanthropists, and Baltimore is actually one of the core focus areas that we're working on. One thing that Robinhood has said is that Robinhood isn't necessarily going to create, Robinhood Orlando or Robinhood Houston. However, there are sister organizations that have grown over these past years, and really we are very open and very open source about sharing information about how we use our metrics, how we literally use data to be able to analyze every single dollar that goes into the investment space, about how Robinhood is actually a place where every single dollar that goes to Robinhood goes directly into the fight, because the board covers all operational expenses. So all OpEx is covered by our board of directors. And so every dollar that comes in, goes directly into the work. And so we now have Tipping Point in the Bay Area. There's a Better Chicago in Chicago. There is Slingshot in Memphis. There's the Constellation Fund in the Twin Cities. There is the Lever Fund in Washington, D.C. And so we've been able to create and work with organizations in other jurisdictions to create essentially sister organizations where we all focus on the same issues. We all focus on this issue of economic opportunity and how do you have job growth, and how do you have places where ambition and potential can actually meet each other, and we are we work very closely to be able to support one another in all of our missions in our respective geographies. So that's really how we've looked at it, and some of the work that we've been doing down here in Baltimore, and also the work we're doing throughout Maryland.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Charles. Thank you. Next question.
Hi, this is Lynn Durbin, and
Hello.
I have two related questions. And the first is, so are you optimistic, Wes, for the future with all that is going on? And then the second, as a follow-up, is knowing, as you say, that philanthropy is really cannot solve these issues. The dollars are too large. Do you see a runway in number of years if we all got behind this, and how long it will take in the legislative policy world to get us to some reasonable form of answer or solution?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lynn, and great seeing you. And actually, let me take the second question first, and then I'll come back to the optimistic question, because I think they're both great questions. They're both tied. One is, you're absolutely right, and I think about this in context of the city of Baltimore, and I think about it in context of the state of Maryland, for example. If you look at some of the biggest infrastructure issues and costs that are coming on board for the city of Baltimore, the truth is that Baltimore doesn't have the budget to be able to have the conversation without understanding how we're going to include the state. And second, in many cases, don't have the jurisdictional authority, right? So whether we're talking about the police department, whether you're talking about the school system, these are all issues that have a shared level of legal responsibility between Baltimore City and also the state of Maryland. So you have Hartford County legislators and Charles County legislators and Baltimore County legislators that are going to have a vote and have a say as to how we're thinking about budgetary allotments and adjustments that are going to be made to what's happening here in Baltimore City. And so the relationship that Baltimore City has with the state is going to be absolutely crucial. It's also going to be absolutely crucial to think about the relationship that the state then is going to have with the federal government. The economic fallout from the pandemic that we have seen thus far has left states with an estimated $555 billion in shortfalls over fiscal years 2020 to 2022, right? $555 billion in shortfalls. Now, here's the thing. Governors have to balance budgets. The federal government is a place where you can actually allocate cash and capital, and where, when we're looking at Fed allotments, where we have a chance to, increase the amount of capital flow and liquidity that's inside the markets, despite the fact that we're still looking at a $26 trillion deficit that we're looking at as a nation. But this is what states have coming up ahead. So I think our ability to be able to have a concerted and a coordinated conversation with our state partners, our ability to have a coordinated conversation with our federal partners is going to be absolutely crucial, especially when you consider the fact that, state revenues take a long time to recover from economic shocks of this magnitude. After the 2008 recession, state tax revenues overall did not return to pre-recession levels for 5 years. And I would argue that what we're seeing right now with COVID-19 could have the impacts of 2008 and then some. And so we really have to think about how we're thinking about levels of coordination, the levels of sacrifices that are going to have to be made in order for us to not just balance budgets, but to truly create pathways of opportunities for individuals and families. The question of am I optimistic is I am. And I know that there's a lot out there that could make us every day wake up and say there's nothing to be optimistic about and everything is falling apart and everything's on fire. And I see it every day. The fact that there's more and more data showing how complicated the road ahead is going to be. But there's two things that I do remember. One, optimism is a choice. We could sit there and we can sulk and we could sit there and curl up in a fetal position if we choose to. I choose not to. I think it just means we got work to do. And that just means that every single day we got to keep chipping, and every day we got to keep chipping. But the choice to do that is one that we as a society and we as individuals can make. The other reason why I'm optimistic is I know these are really hard and complicated times, and everyone, statistically can show me that this is different from 9/11. It is. This is different from the economic downturn of 2008. It is. But I know that we've seen hard times before. And I know that whether there were people in our nation's history, there were ancestors who saw some really hard times, and they kept fighting, and they kept pushing, and they kept pushing and fighting because they knew that even though there might be some complicated times that we were going to see ahead, that we actually could forge a better future, one that they might not even see, if they keep pushing. And so when I think about where we are right now and the very significant hills that are standing, I'm not naive, but I also just know that I refuse to, and the idea of curling up in a fetal position is a choice, and that's not one that I plan on doing. There's nothing that we as a community can see again that will ever make us flinch if we think about the things that we have seen in the past. And so how then do we take a level of consistency and calm, and also an understanding that the only way we're going to make it through this thing right now is if we come up with a sense of unity around it. Because the fastest way for this thing to fall apart is not going to be an explosion, it's going to be an implosion.
Right. And done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next question. Give as much time as we can. Oh, there's Willie Moore.
Yep. Good afternoon. This is
How are you, Willie?
Great, thanks. I appreciate your taking the time to chat with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
There's an old adage, how do you eat an elephant, but one bite at a time, and we've got one heck of an elephant of a problem. And you just mentioned chipping away at the problem. We're the most violent city in the country. It's hard to imagine outside businesses wanting to relocate into our city. So we have to, the breadth of our problems are so deep. We need short-term problems and we need long-term problems. Excuse me, short-term solutions and long-term solutions. So I wonder, for you to chip away at this, obviously what's better to get somebody out of poverty than a family supporting wage, a job that provides a family supporting wage. And that's only one minor piece of this enormous puzzle. What do you see as the priorities for long-term and short-term? Best ways to maximize the benefit of every dollar that doesn't exist, that we have to fight for to solve the problem.
Thank you, Willie, for that. And you're right. I mean, this is one hell of an elephant that we have sitting in front of us. Well, first, I think that we have to understand that there are certain fundamentals, and it does have to be both a short-term and a long-term solution. But there's certain fundamentals that it's inexcusable that we still have not figured certain components out. And actually, ironically, if we could even take a look at the existence of Freddie Gray that we were talking about before, it actually serves, if we allow it to, it serves as an interesting roadmap about how we should be thinking about this, right? Because, step one is, are we making sure that we are providing a pathway for children to being born safely and healthy into this world, right? The fact that we still to this day in the state of Maryland have tens of thousands of children who are being, diagnosed with lead poisoning is unacceptable. We have known that lead is a neurotoxin in this country for a century. But we've been incredibly color and class coded in the way that we've dealing with this. And so an ability to be able to say, can we make a fundamental promise that we can do structural changes to make sure that every child is born safe and healthy into our communities? We can do that. We know that we can make basic adjustments on even things like, child tax credits that we could essentially, literally in the stroke of a pen, eliminate deep child poverty within our society. Now, the thing we also have to be able to do is, to your point, not just do kind of like an intellectual audit of all of our systems. How are we making sure that we're using money wisely? How are we making sure that the investments that we're making within our budgets are things that are going to actually provide opportunities for people and not just continuing to build up and calcify a system that needs fundamental adjustment? But the other thing we need is consistency. I say this with all respect. But, we've had 5 police commissioners in the city of Baltimore in 5 years. We've had 4 mayors in 5, or we'll have 4 mayors come December, in 5 years. We need consistency, because there are plans that are being put in place that oftentimes are plans that have a real ability, I believe in working. I have to tell you, I think the police commissioner we have in Baltimore is frankly one of the best in the country. I think we also, though, have a process and a challenge of making sure that we can give things time to show that they can work, and then being able to make adjustments as to how they can actually work. And so there has to be a level of consistency, there has to be a level of honesty and transparency, there has to be a level of trust. Because if those elements are not in sync, and if you don't have those levels of transparency and consistency, you'll never have that sense of trust. That also becomes incredibly important as we're thinking about ways of being able to deal with high levels of crime, ways of being able to deal with things like the unemployment challenge. Because I'm also a big believer is that if you really want to understand what's going on with violence, oftentimes in neighborhoods, you can watch a direct correlation between violence and unemployment, and violence and hopelessness, right? And so how then do we then have to be able to craft all of those two things simultaneously, where we can deal with the long-term vision of being able to support our children at their earliest stages, which, by the way, is economically the best investment that you can make when it comes to basic ROI, but also deal with the very real issues that we're dealing with right now. The third component, and I'll say very, very quickly, is an ability to be able to support small businesses, an ability to be able to support entrepreneurs, and an ability at the same time to know that going and attracting businesses to the area and supporting individual businesses that are already here do not have to be mutually exclusive conversations, right? This is about how can we create more platforms to provide economic opportunities for people who are here within the area. And then obviously then with that comes everything from how do we deal with the transportation issue? How do we deal with the education job training issues? But these have to be holistic conversations that have a measure of consistency and transparency and longevity, which is going to lead to the buildup of trust.
Wes, I'm going to ask something in the interest of time. You, in your book, somebody sent me a quote, so I'm going to, justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are, said Ben Franklin. And what you capture in your book is just the breadth, the scope of those here in this city that were so impacted by the death of Freddie Gray and what then ensued. And there was a coming together and a sense of resolve that we had to deal with these issues. And of course, in our country right now, we have the politics of enemyism, such that there's just stalemate. And if you're not with us, you're against us. And so, although you're hopeful, and I want to be as hopeful as you are, how do we get beyond this?
I think this issue of enemyism is real. If I'm just being completely frank, though, I also think it's also what just grabs the headlines and the attentions and what gets put on loops. I think we do have a very real element within our society right now, which its anger and its evilness has been exposed and unleashed. And frankly, instead of having leaders that are trying to deal with it, they become its cheerleaders. And there's something amazingly dangerous about that. And it cannot be understated, and it cannot be removed as a factor. The thing also, though, that I know is that this idea of enemyism is actually, it's not the prevailing wisdom in our society. It can feel that way sometimes. And it can feel that way when we are spending our time, just constantly consumed with it, or what this person said, or what happened in this part of Florida, or this part of, Eastern Shore, or this part in New York, where it can feel like, oh my gosh, the world is completely falling apart. I just don't believe that to be true. I think what we're happening and what we're seeing is there is a true and a genuine level of fear and instability that people are feeling. And I feel like they're feeling a real level of fear and instability for reasons that are completely justified. Because we have watched how people can see how their supports or their lives can be upended, not just overnight, but for things that they feel they're not at all responsible for. And that we do have a safety net that's creating this level of societal fragility that is making people incredibly uncertain about where their future lies. And I think with uncertainty also presents, not just decisions, but fears that manifest themselves in different ways. I think that the way I approach it and the way I look at it is not necessarily saying that, tribalism has become the common thread. I do not believe that. I believe the way we're going to deal with that is deal with people's uncertainties and to deal with people's fears. We have to be able to deal with the fact that we still do have a history within this country that still has to get dealt with. And there are, and again, I'm speaking specifically about this issue of structural and systemic racism that is still very real within our society. And frankly, it's one of the reasons that I've long been an advocate for that the United States, both on a national level, but also on a local geography level, should go through a similar type of process that over a dozen other countries have had the courage to go through, which is really thinking deeply about how do we have a truth commission? How do we have an honest conversation about our history, and knowing that loving your country doesn't mean lying about it. It means that we have to be able to contend and grapple with the fact that we have had a tremendously uneven history within this country. And whether it was South Africa, whether it was Germany, whether it was Northern Ireland, whether it was Burundi, whether it was Rwanda, whether it was Argentina, whether it was Colombia, whether it was Canada twice. We've had countries that were willing to stare at their deepest wounds and know that the only way that we can move forward is if we're able to actually understand those deep wounds. So I do think that the country needs to go through some form of process along those lines. But I also do believe that the fear of essentially a tribalism is one that we can contend with and say this is where we are right now. But I believe there's something deeper rooted in that and how we have this increasing level of instability and uncertainty that is really driving so much of the stuff that we're talking about right now.
Wes, you make abundantly clear that we need more time for this for CenterView. We commit to doing this in an hour so that we can, but it's not nearly sufficient to cover all of your good insights. And you leave on a message of hope, though. So you're closing on that.
I tell you, can you say okay? You okay? I can say that I leave on a measure. I leave on a measure of hope, and we've had everybody.
Hi.
Because I just know that for each and every one of us, I mean, our hope is very tangible, right? There's a reason that we're gonna fight every single day for a better tomorrow, because I believe deeply that when you know why you're fighting, you don't stop fighting, right? And so I'm thankful to not just to have every single one of you as people who we're going to be in this work for as long as we can breathe. But again, I'm thankful that all of your work, you're making a better way for our kids, and I appreciate you for that.
Wes, thank you, and thanks for staying in Baltimore, folks. If you don't have it, go get it. Get it on Amazon or download it. Hey, Daddy's book. And I'll swing by and you can sign mine, Wes. You haven't signed mine yet. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Thank you, Wes. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
And everybody, tune in next month. We'll be communicating about our next CenterView. Wes, it's great to see you and have you. Thank you, everyone.
Blessings, everybody.
Bye.
Thank y'all. Bye-bye.
Well, that's a pussy.